All right, we are live.
Oh, cool. Okay. So then just sharing
I'm going to share
the
that link
YouTube link,
page. Yep.
right? Okay, perfect. Awesome. So while we wait for folks to hop on and for social media folks to share out the link, Matt, do you wanna get us going?
Totally. Um, what's up, everyone? Happy Earth Day. Um, just to get us started, we're just doing like a little bit of like a little mindfulness exercise, kind of get us in the moment. So if you're comfortable, like, well, first like get comfortable, like sit comfortably or something. If you're comfortable with it, close your eyes. If not, just picture it up top. So let's just start first with a like really nice, like deep cleansing breath in. So and then just like hold it for a couple seconds and then release and breathe out. So sorry. So on this next inhale, start to picture some time that you really felt connected to nature or the environment around you, sometime in your childhood and your early life, just something that has some meaning. So inhale with that. So just kind of sit with it for a couple seconds. Really get the scene set all around you. Who's with you? What are you doing? Where are you? And so then exhale and hold on to that. Keep that in your mind's eye. And then, let's inhale again. So inhale and start to think about how that helped you develop as a person. What effect did those experiences have on you? And sit with that while you exhale. So do that for a couple, like one or two more rounds of inhaling and exhale, a couple more rounds of breaths. And then once you feel like you have some idea of that, start to think about how you would be different if you didn't have those experiences and what would have happened. And that's something that a lot of people have to deal with just in general with losing these experiences to climate change. So as you start to come back, I'm gonna toss it over and start thinking about some discussion questions for us. So just like, if anybody wants to hop in with this, like what did you grow up believing about climate change? Like, where did you hear about it? What connotations did it have? Yeah.
I actually remember learning about climate change in my 8th grade Earth and Space Science class, and thinking like, "Whoa, this is wild." It was the first time I had never heard of it before, and then yeah, one of my classmates raised her hand and said his name is Mr. Rhodes. Mr. Rhodes, what if we don't believe in climate change? And was like so blown away. I had just learned about climate change, and now I'm learning that there's like this, yeah, whole sect of people or mindset or whatever you want to call it that doesn't believe in climate change. I just remember being like so confused about everything.
Oh, I saw Serena put in the chat that she believed that it was all about the animals and that people were fine, but we had to save the polar bears. I don't know if you want to like expand on that at all. Talk more about that.
I think in my like earliest science classes, I remember even like freshman year, I took an earth sciences class and we talked about climate change a little bit, but it wasn't, I had no idea that it was this, existential crisis and threat that will alter life as we know it. And I thought about it more as like, save the polar bears, stop the ice caps from melting, which are also all really important pieces. But just my understanding of the scope of this crisis and what it would mean for me and for right here is very different from what I now know.
Um,
Oh, I thought someone to go. Well, I was raised kind of on the far right, and I didn't believe in climate change until I went to college and heard it from my professors who are climate scientists. And having that like personal connection made it hit home. I remember when I was on my 16th birthday, going to the Goggle Works and seeing Al Gore's film with my friend and her parents, and being so overwhelmed by how just hopeless it seemed, and it just like didn't register. Like I went to that and was like, this is so awful, and then just kind of like fully rejected it. And it didn't really feel like emotionally or like intellectually like reality until I was in college, and then after that when I started to see things with my own eyes.
My first memory of it wasn't necessarily climate change, but sometimes my dad would sit me down and be like, I have some words of wisdom, and he would share with me some like terrifying story about the reality of the world. And the environmental one I really remember is him talking about the need to recycle batteries responsibly, otherwise they would get tossed into dumps and then leak acid into the groundwater, and then we would have acid rain, and that would be our whole future.
I can go. My experience was very so theoretical. It was I remember learning about chlorofluorocarbons that would be released from the refrigerators, and I would be so angry. And they would talk about ozone depletion and stuff like that. It was very theoretical for me. I didn't look into it deeply, but then all I would do was to turn the refrigerators off every time and would kind of like be angry with my mom. But that's pretty much like what I learned about like ozone layer depletion and CFCs. Basically, I'm happy I know now more than ever before.
So I can come at it from a totally different generation because I'm all older than you, except Jane. I didn't know anything either until Al Gore's film, honestly, because even though I was involved in the environmental movement through the 70s and 80s and land conservation, I mean, the things we talked about that were going to save the planet was just, recycling and picking up your trash and simple things that were going to save the earth. There was a book like that. I'll show it to you later. But when that came up and it got to be such a serious issue, it's a whole different thing. But we were lied to for decades, so we didn't know about it either till I guess the original movie came out in 2006. Yeah, so just planting trees is really great, but it's not enough, and there's so much more we have to do. And it wasn't honestly till I got involved with Indivisible and Sunrise and Berg Stands Up that I realized that the environmental movement and then what we have to do to save ourselves and save the planet is much more of a political uprooting than I ever thought it would be. So that I know is really important.
Yeah, I got to second what Risa said. We didn't know anything, and the height of our awareness was separating glass and cans and newspapers. Right. And at one point it was green glass, blue glass, brown glass, clear glass, and that was, I don't know. I'm sure it all went into the same bin and probably got shipped to China. But I sort of dimly remember when I was in my 20s that there were environmentalists. But at the time, the biggest issue for me was the Vietnam War, and it was separate. I think that's like the big takeaway for me, as I see right now, is that all of it was separate. It was like there were environmentalists, and they wore Birkenstocks, and they were a little precious. They were very precious, in fact. And then there was the rest of us who were fighting against the war, and underneath all of that was no analysis at all. So the sense that of interconnectedness that we all understand now simply wasn't there.
Thank you, everyone, for sharing your stories. And before we move into the bulk of what today will be, I'd like us all to take a minute and think about something that we're afraid to lose. Sometimes, I know for me, it can feel so overwhelming to think about everything, and to just break it down to one simple thing to like hold into my heart kind of reminds me why I care, why I'm so passionate, why I'm doing this. So let's all take a minute to do that. And then if you want to unmute yourself as you feel called and share something, that would be wonderful.
The summer after high school, my friends and I would wake up every morning and pack all of our stuff and our snacks and our food and our adventure gear, and just spend the day wandering around Blue Marsh until the sun went down. And we would do that, like every day this whole summer. And there's like a childlike kind of whimsy I get when reflecting back to that. So that I'm afraid of losing that.
Thanks for sharing that. Does anyone else want to share?
I really resonated with that, Troy, and especially like the emotion in your voice of thinking about those times. And I agree a lot when I think back on my childhood. I'm really happy with all the time I spent climbing in the trees and like being in this sun-soaked green areas and not being concerned about why it's so warm. And I'm sad to lose that. And I'm really sad that my nieces and nephews and the other kids aren't gonna like have that same thing.
I've spent the last 3 years earning my living working outside in different outdoor recreation environments. I've been a raft guide, and I would work at a summer camp every summer, getting kids in the outdoor adventure industry, and it's so fun and it's so beautiful to just like see kids get engaged outside and learn about water and learn about hiking and just like the different ways that nature can become this like fun, exciting thing. And to think about the possibility of not only not being able to work in that field, but just children not having that opportunity in the future is honestly really heartbreaking. And that's not something that I ever want to see. I want to be able to teach kids how to exist outside for the rest of my life.
Kayla, those are exactly my emotions and my thoughts as well. I have a new granddaughter who was just born last summer, and my son luckily takes a lot after me, and he's taking her outside and showing her things, but I kind of wanted to be the one to do that, and I'm not getting to now, but I'm hoping I'll have a chance. But yeah, like like Celine and Troy and just being outside. I used to climb trees in my backyard all the time, and just that we're going to lose not only the beauty of the earth, but the spiritual quality that we all need in nature, that we're going to lose the ecosystems that support us, and that we're going to lose civilized society. People will go crazy. I mean, look how crazy they are now. I'm afraid it's only going to get worse.
Yeah, I feel like I resonate with a lot of what's been said. And for me personally, a lot of like my childhood was a lot of digging in the dirt, less about climbing trees, but I have fond memories of whether it was planting things in the ground or playing with my brother's old little like Mack truck things and building like racetracks in the dirt. But as an adult, I think the biggest thing that I would really miss is the simplicity of gardening in the summertime and just gardening in my bare feet and kind of not only like touching the soil with my bare hands, but feeling the soil with my bare feet underneath me. And also having that time in nature to not only just like go wander around in nature, but also like be able to feel like freely able to write poetry, because I feel like the best places that I write poetry are in nature.
Thanks everyone for sharing. Really loved hearing about all these special places and fears and hopes and things that we're reminiscing about. So let's carry those places with us as we move into the rest of today. And I'd like to pass it to Troy to get us started.
Thanks so much, Serena, and Matt, and everyone who shared. Yeah, I'm gonna ground us in why we're here today. It's the 50th anniversary birthday, and 50 years ago, the promise of a livable future was threatened by the greed of a few wealthy men. People at the time rose to the challenge and organized, and on this day, 50 years ago, 20 million people in the US mobilized because environmental degradation threatened the air they breathed, the water they drank, the people they loved, and the places they called home. 20 million people was just shy of 10% of the US population in 1970. This level of mobilizing paved the way for the most comprehensive environmental legislation that this country has ever seen. But as a country, we've really kind of lost touch with our Earth Day roots. These days, even Exxon celebrates Earth Day. There is once again an existential threat to the people that we love and the places that we call home. And it's never been more important to ask ourselves, what happened to Earth Day? And I am gonna share my screen for some visuals here. Great. So before we launch into this, I want to give everyone watching some immediate ways to plug in. And the first one is to join a welcome call with us this Friday at 2:30 at bit.ly/sunrisebergswelcome. The other one is to sign up for text and email updates from us here at your local Sunrise Hub. That's bit.ly/sunrisebergs. The other thing is in this time of coronavirus and the economic downturn, our partners at Berg Stands Up have crafted a pretty comprehensive petition to our county commissioners about how they need to respond to this current crisis. And that is at bit.ly/Bergs COVID petition. And some folks will be dropping that in the chat. And now I want to pass it to Celine to take it away.
Hi. All right. So, climate change is intensifying, and we must remain rooted in the fact that the climate crisis is happening right now. We're facing a crisis the likes of which we have never seen before, and we are probably all here because we are uncertain about the future in various ways. In order to stay focused in our work, we have to honor what we're fighting for and stay rooted in our values and our own stake here. Can anybody name some of the impacts that we'll see from massive climate change? You can call them out, you can drop them in the chat if you'd like. I'll read them aloud.
Flooding.
Yeah, flooding. We see that happening here in Berks County a lot. Anybody else?
Loss of species.
Loss of species, a huge one. Seeing island nations are disappearing, Jane said. Serena mentioned the intense hurricanes. That brings me to the tornadoes right now. We're having the most intense tornado season in the South that we have ever seen. Australia on fire, Katrina, loss of forests. These are all great. Thank you for mentioning this. So as you guys mentioned, these natural disasters are becoming more and more deadly as a result of the climate crisis. And all across the global South, the climate crisis is causing destruction to the people and the places least responsible in causing it. Does anybody have examples of how climate change is impacting us? And that could be like locally, or maybe how your family is affected in different areas. I know we all have family living in different states. And again, you can call that out. You can drop it in the chat.
I can say that that there's a clear example of communities of color being exposed to a lot more air pollutants, and that is like really directly connected to the people who are more likely to contract COVID and more likely to then die from that virus.
Absolutely. And that's something that our country has been putting in place and making this happen, and ignoring the pleas of these people and what they should be doing for the sake of these fossil fuel billionaires and all of these other massive companies and billionaires that are putting what they need, which is money, it's not really a need, above what we need, which is clean air, water, and just being able to live a good life safely. Oh, I see Jane dropped in here. Skin cancer. Yeah. And Serena mentioned the flooding ruining the farmland and the crops. Would you like to elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure. 2 summers ago, we had I think it was about a 40% increase in rain. We had the amount of rain that we usually get in a majority of the year concentrated in like a month or two. And I mean, we saw this again last year, but I think 2 summers ago was like the first time that we saw this change in our weather patterns and climate here. And I saw, right outside my house and on the news, pictures of farm fields just filled with water. Some like cattle had drowned, crops were being washed out. And you can't harvest crops when they're completely saturated with water, so that makes things challenging. And it's really scary to think about what that could lead to in terms of like food shortages and things like that.
Absolutely. Thank you for mentioning that. I think that's really vital to think about, as so much of the land we have around us is probably full of crops, and we're seeing this happen to our local farmers. I'm going to move on to the next slide. Thank you, Troy. So these are slides of just some headlines about the disasters that have hit in recent years, and only a few examples. There are so many more, and we didn't even count the smaller insidious effects of climate change either. So I'm just going to take a second to read out a couple of these. From the HuffPost, as climate change hits Miami, only the rich will be able to protect themselves, which we see again in COVID-19 and how the rich are able to protect themselves over the city of Miami and the people there. The Nation, climate change is here and it looks like starvation. The Guardian, the unseen driver behind the migrant caravan, which is climate change. So finally, we know that climate change will not affect us all equally. It will be most severe for frontline communities of mostly low income and Black, Brown, and Indigenous peoples. And in this moment, I want to pass it to Priya to tell us a story about the climate crisis and what they're fighting for.
Hello all, my name is Priya. I am very proud to say that I was born in one of the oldest nations in the world, India. In India, we speak 22 languages and 415 dialects. I'm proud to say I can speak 6 languages of those, which is roughly, say, 27%. I had the chance to experience India from late 80s to 2008 when I moved to the US. We were a working class family. We lived with my dad's 2 brothers and 1 sister. It was a big joint family. My dad took the public transport to go to work every day until the day he passed away in 2019. He took the public transport. Growing up, I walked to school every day, or my uncle would drop me off on a bicycle. My fondest memories were sharing stories when we would walk or ride together to school. My greatest memories were from playing outside, like the rest of you all. We played from sunrise to sunset on days we didn't have school. That was one of the ways we connected directly to the Mother Earth. We were grounded and didn't take it for granted. We never had cars or any of that luxury. A small TV that played 2 channels and no other means of really communicating with the rest of the world. I can never forget the memories of going on a train to visit my grandparents in the cheapest available economy ticket, that experiencing fresh air, looking outside at little huts with dim lights, looking at vast green fields where Indian women were dressed in sari, this long drapey Indian clothes, and the men in Indian attire toiling away in the sun, yet somehow very happy doing all of that stuff. We visited our grandparents in villages for every summer vacation. My dad's brothers and his dads were all farmers. They grow rice and they grow coconuts. I remember waiting to go to their farms to play with their water pump and to climb coconut trees. It was so exciting. I would never make it, they're so tall, but it was the exciting part of going to the farms. The cheapest means were the best ways to experience nature, yet somehow today we're so disconnected from it, even though we have made a lot of improvements and can afford a lot more. India is the second most populated country in the world. About 2/3 of the people live in rural areas in India. 70% of rural people depend on agriculture. 80% of farmers are small and marginal. India is the second largest producer of rice and wheat. This gives you kind of an idea about what India's dependency on agriculture and farming is, right? Low-income populations bear the brunt of climate change, like we just talked about. I have read stories of Indian farmers that want to commit suicide, not being able to pay their debts because of either rain or drought that destroyed their crops. An example of a cyclone that hit South India that brought the coconut trees down, especially around where my family lived. And the farmers had to clear the land for replantation. They, however, did not have the money to start work or employ earth movers. In 2018, an average of 10 farmers died daily. Just type farmers suicides in India on a Google search to really understand the seriousness of this situation. Farmers feel the effects of increasing temperature. They're having to deal with seeds that cannot withstand drought or deep waters. They're having to continuously come up with solutions that can withstand these conditions. Dams and irrigation techniques are helping small-scale farmers, but they're still in debt, not being able to adapt to everyday changing condition and not being able to put food on their plates. People are dying every day due to climate change. Heavy rains and flooding destroyed people's homes. Many areas don't have accessible drinking water. People have to stand in long queues just to get drinkable water in India. I remember these women carrying two containers and get water as much as you can because you're working all day, you're tired. So it's as sad as that is. This vulnerability, though, is not India's own doing. In terms of global greenhouse gas emissions, India's share remains significantly lower than both of the US and China, which is the developed countries right now. Many ways the marginalized people have to pay the price. Can we let this all sink in? This is what climate change is doing. And why are we constantly destroying the planet that is helping us live? To close, I want to share a quote by Greta Thunberg. Right now, it's more relevant than ever. Our house is still on fire, and your inaction is fueling the flames by hour. Please do something. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing your story with us, Priya. I really, really appreciated getting to hear that. And I just wanted to offer a little bit of resonance for you. I really felt right there with you in the way in which you described the farms that your family had. And I felt the pain of learning about how many people are losing their lives because of climate change and a thing that they can't control. It really broadens my view about like what type of loss there is on top of just losing crops for these farmers. Does anybody else have anything they want to offer?
Priya, I felt joy in my heart when you described your like climbing coconut trees and those memories. Thanks for sharing.
Thank you. Thank you.
We've got a little bit of resonance over here. Serena said, whoa, I love the line, cheapest ways, the cheapest ways are the best ways to connect with nature. David loved that, powerful messages. One last chance, anybody has any other resonance they want to offer before I pass it off to Serena?
Yeah, I'm really struck by the poles of what Priya said, the joy of climbing the coconut trees and is just feeling that, and then the incredible grief of the suicides and those trees being knocked down, and it's an intense story that reflects a really intense extreme reality.
Yeah, thank you, Jane. Yeah, so now I'm going to pass this off to Serena and she'll share the next section.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing. So yes, climate change is intensifying, but I want to remain grounded in the fact that it's not all heavy news. Because even though climate change is this big international crisis, we have the solutions to stop the climate crisis. In Pennsylvania, there's actually more people working in the renewable energy field than there are working in the fossil fuel industry, despite the fact that Pennsylvania has, you know, in the soil here, there's a lot of like natural gas reserves. So I find that very hopeful. And not only do we have the technological know-how to replace the fossil fuel economy, but we're talking about solutions that are at the scale of the crisis. So picture a Green New Deal for the United States and the globe, one that would put millions of people to work building a sustainable and fair society. That's what we're talking about. I love that vision. I love that future. So for the past several decades, the solutions that were offered to us were not very useful. They were things like turn the lights off when you leave the room and use energy efficient light bulbs, and recycle after you use all those disposable water bottles. And we saw our politicians introducing very watered down climate solutions. But the Green New Deal has completely changed the game. It addresses climate catastrophe and economic inequality and racial justice, all at the scale that science and that justice demand. Over a 10-year period, the Green New Deal would mobilize every aspect of American society to meet the historic challenges that are presented by climate change, environmental degradation, economic inequality, racial justice, all of those things. And this will be one of the largest structural reforms in American society. And the Green New Deal is not just a bill or resolution. It's a set of actions. And the Green New Deal defines a new political common sense, a governing agenda for the 21st century in which our government cares about us and wants to serve the people. And people believe in this future. To date, I just looked up the numbers last night. I had to change what we had written down, which was super exciting. 99 House representatives and 14 senators have signed onto the Green New Deal resolution. Wow. I remember when there were 2. and I mean, look at what we can do. Look at the power that we have. And so I feel so excited about a Green New Deal, what that would mean for renewable energy and a healthy reconnection with the land. And I'd like to ask all of you what excites you about the Green New Deal. You can drop it in the chat or just hop off of mute, whatever works for you.
I'm very excited about the expansion of renewable resources and moving away from all of these things that are destroying our planet.
I'm excited at the idea of public ownership of utilities.
Something I'm really excited about that Matt also mentioned is the intersectional approach and kind of picking up where the New Deal failed in understanding the intersectionality these issues have with one another.
Yeah, awesome. I'm going to read a few things in the chat. Chloe is excited about oops, that's the wrong thing. Matt is excited about the intersectional approach that the Green New Deal brings. David is excited about young people and excited that young people are excited about it. Chloe is excited about more accessible public transit. Great things to be excited about. Thanks, everyone. So I'm going to pass it off to Matt, who will take us into our next section.
So, all right, we have the solutions, right? So what are we waiting for? Why can't we just start, putting them in place already? Well, and you might already know this, there are a small handful of people who have put a lot of effort into stopping progress. And they are fossil fuel executives, and they've mounted a deliberate decades-long strategy to protect their profits and block any progress on climate change at the expense of our own survival. And here's the thing, fossil fuel billionaires, the elites, the people who make billions of dollars in profit don't want anything to change, and they're willing to let millions of people die and live in poverty and to turn people against each other so that they can maybe just keep making money. And so to do that, they use a 3-pronged strategy. And the first prong was to deceive the people, and then they wanted to buy out the politicians, and now they are then it's to consolidate power within the government. So first off, on the note of deceiving the people, we're going to look at the example of ExxonMobil, the largest private oil company in the world, and they are not the only group doing this, but they're an example. In 1978, Exxon actually had better climate research than anybody because it's a company full of scientists. And Xavier, can you read this first quote?
Yeah, I can take that. From the ExxonMobil internal documents, they said, man has a time window of 5 to 10 years before the need for hard decisions regarding changes in energy strategies might become critical. And that was in 1978.
Yeah, so that just shows that, like, they knew. Like, it's insane. And Kayla, can you take this second one?
Sure. They denied. CEO Lee Raymond arguing against Kyoto Protocol in 1997. There's a lot we really don't know about how climate change will change in the 21st century and beyond. We need to understand the issue better, and fortunately, we have time. It is highly unlikely that the temperature in the middle of the next century will be significantly affected, whether policies are enacted now or 20 years from now.
But just imagine if it had gone differently and we may have been well on our way to stopping climate change by now. And as the science caught up to them, they had to change their tune yet again. Xavier, can you just take this last one too?
Yeah, I can take that. From a British campaigner named Andrew Warren, he said, Raymond is no longer seeking to deny the science behind climate change. Instead, he simply predicts an endless rise in the demand for fossil fuels his company sells and maintains that there is nothing that can be done to alter that. And that was in 2005.
Yeah, it's crazy. They decided to just basically stick their heads in the sand about it. So then after they deceived the public, phase 2 was to buy out the politicians. And a textbook example of this is the Koch brothers, and they're just cartoonishly evil fossil fuel billionaires. And their company, Koch Industries, makes money from refining oil, coal-fired power plants, pipelines, and other such industries. And their father contracted for both Hitler and Stalin. And they had a combined net worth of $86 billion. So the Koch brothers have 86 billion reasons to block government action on climate because they will lose that money if we act to stop climate change. It's as simple as that. And so there's a lot of politicians to buy out, and they're still at work. The Koch network spent $750 million in the last election, and they didn't spend much at all on the presidential race. So the vast majority went to congressional and statewide races, as you can see, like with how much was like spent there. And this is just what we know about campaign spending in the 2016 election. They are essentially operating as a third party. This is unprecedented in modern American politics. And although the Koch brothers have supported many Republicans, Democrats have also taken a significant amount of fossil fuel money, both from the Koch network and elsewhere. So the result of all this spending is that any Republican who takes a moderate position on climate change, or a lot of other things for that matter, gets hit with attack ads and a challenger for the upcoming primary. And 2, even plenty of Democrats are taking money from fossil fuel interests, either in the Koch network or elsewhere, and there's plenty of dirty money to go around. So they've been building up their network for decades, and now their spending is at an all-time high, and it's finally paying off. And we already see the effects of it. So last March, when the Green New Deal resolution went to a vote in the Senate, they bought out politicians were a lot more likely to vote against it. So yes, even the Senate Democrats who voted against the resolutions received more than twice as much fossil fuel billionaire money as their counterparts. And this stat right here, that one, that's $900,000 on average. That's crazy. That's insane. So senators who don't back the Green New Deal on average receive 7 times as much fossil fuel cash. That's crazy. I mean, Koch Industries spent $2.45 million in federal lobbying against the Green New Deal. So now we have 2 prongs of their 3-part strategy. They deceived the public and they bought out the politicians. So the next part of it was to consolidate power in the government. And once they shifted the political common sense like that, we get to the 3rd part of the fossil fuel billionaires 3-part strategy. Like I just said, the consolidating power within the government. So Trump's government is ripe with fossil fuel interests, and there are so many examples of this that we can go through. literally dozens of people. Trump took it to the next level, but even Obama's administration was ripe with fossil fuel interests. So this gives them an unprecedented ability to influence policy at every single level. And so like, I just want to invite Shayna on to share a bit of her experience with this.
I have a technical difficulty, so can somebody just catch up? I'll come back in like 5 minutes. Sorry.
Sure,
No
man.
worries.
Radio DJ it.
Sweet. So just for anyone who's just joining us, today we're jumping into the history of Earth Day and how we've ended up facing the very same existential threats to our air, water, homes, and lives 50 years later. But don't worry, we're also covering our solutions to enact comprehensive economic and environmental changes to create a sustainable future. So here's some quick actions that you can take to stay up to date with Sunrise and ask our county commissioners to take appropriate action against COVID-19. So, like we said at the beginning, you can join our welcome call that's on Friday at 2:30 at bit.ly/sunriseberkswelcome. You can sign up for email and text updates from your local hub, again at bit.ly/sunriseberks. And you can sign this emergency petition to the county commissioners regarding COVID-19 response at bit.ly/Berks COVID petition. So with that, I'm going to throw it over to Troy. And yeah. I think you're on mute.
I was indeed. So after everything that we covered, yeah, the main point that we are driving home here is that as long as the current political establishment is in power, we cannot win the Green New Deal. I know that I get like so furious when I see all this. It's really outrageous, and it's a sign of the way that our political system has utterly failed everyday Americans. We have to recognize that we cannot make sweeping changes with the current political establishment. So what do we have to do? We got to take over. Where they deceive the public, we will bring the promise of an America that works for all of us into every corner of this country with policies like the Green New Deal. Where they bought out politicians, we'll elect people's champions who will fight for a government that works for all of us and an economy for the common person. Where they consolidated power in the government, we will build a new political common sense where sweeping government action for the good of the working class is possible. So let's take a look at the 2018 midterm elections. Young people were energized like never before. We were knocking on doors, we were sending texts to our friends, we were organizing our campuses and our communities, and it showed. Candidates in the midterm elections were talking about climate change like we'd never heard before, and rejecting contributions from fossil fuel billionaires. But by October in 2018, we made a lot of headway, but still had a long way to go. That's when this headline is from. Dems damp down hopes for climate change agenda. So we see that climate change was still not a top political priority, even in the Democratic Party. This was a sorry case of priorities for the Democrats until this political confrontation that we had in Nancy Pelosi's office went viral. Democrats had taken back the House, and Pelosi was likely the next Speaker of the House. The media was in this place of limbo, looking for how to cover and analyze the election results. So on November 13th, exactly 1 week after the midterm elections, Sunrise occupied Pelosi's office with 250 young people. We were joined by then Congresswoman-elect Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and teamed up to launch the vision of the Green New Deal. This was the explosion that put the Green New Deal and climate change more broadly on top of the political agenda. Only 250 people in the right place with the right message would change the world. To speak more specifically about this, I want to invite Serena up to share her experience.
I was thinking about the first time that I heard about the Green New Deal. I was sitting on these brown couches with fellow Sunrisers in the living room of the movement house that we had in Downingtown in the summer of 2018. And we just returned home from a long day of canvassing for local climate champions. It was a really hot day. And I remember someone brought up this idea about a Green New Deal. And I just had this warm feeling of joy and comfort rising in my body. And it sounded like a dream to me. And for me, growing up in Chester County, I have been surrounded very directly by nature my whole life. There's a nature preserve that surrounds my home. There's a lot of other protected land that's just a bike ride away. And as a kid, I loved having the great outdoors as my own personal playground. I had trees to climb, as a lot of other people mentioned, that was really important to me. Logs to balance on, rocks to hop between. And it was a place where I could run freely through golden alfalfa fields or dark green oak forests and feel safe and comfortable. Nature has always been a really safe space for me, and a place that I can go to when I'm feeling stressed out. I can open my door, go outside, feel the sun on my face or my feet in the grass or the rain on my head, and I immediately feel better, and just relief floods through my body. But even in the quiet moments when I'm searching for some solace, I feel the weight of the need for a Green New Deal. There's a place that's about a 5-minute walk from where I live, and we like to call it the Beach Woods because it's this beautiful forest, really crisp air, pristine. It's mostly filled with beech trees, which is where it gets its name from. And I love being there. But because of all the increased heavy rains that we've been getting recently for the past few years now, the creek overflows and the water washes away soil and erodes around the roots, and it gets muddy, and the trail becomes impassable for a lot of the spring and summer. And that just, such a small thing, but really just brings it home for me. So back to the action. That was just several months after that initial living room conversation. I found myself in the halls of power singing and chanting with several hundred other people, including Troy and maybe Sarah, though I didn't know them yet and I didn't know that they were there. But we were all together as nature lovers and justice advocates, and we were united to demand a Green New Deal for all. And the night before the action, I felt jittery and excited and a little bit unsure. But then I woke up the next morning. We were going to be descending on the Capitol in just a few hours, and my emotions were replaced with resolve and with strength and with anticipation, because we were hundreds strong, sleeping in a church together, sharing stories, getting ready, and we were from all over the country, and it was so powerful just to see how we were coming together to demand action, to fight for what we believe in and what we know is right. We come right after the election, as Troy mentioned. We fought so hard to elect leaders, and now it's our turn to say, okay, we got you in, and we supported you, and we will continue to support you, but you have to support us and everyone, because this is about so much more than any one person or any political ploy or anything. And so it was so empowering to be there, and I left that day with that same warm feeling in my body. And thinking back to that evening in the hot, cramped living room with the brown couches, I realized that I thought of the Green New Deal as a dream, and I wasn't sure that the ideas would ever become more than that. I wasn't sure that our conversation would ever break through the walls of our living room. But now these ideas and conversations fill the living rooms of Americans from all walks of life, all over the country. And that's amazing. I love thinking about this story because it reminds me about how much power we truly have, and it gets me really, really hyped up to take our power.
Wow. Thanks, Serena. I know I felt it. I felt like a bubbling in my chest when you were talking about the mix of emotions the night before the action. Yeah, thanks for sharing. Does anyone else, either in the chat or take yourself off mute, want to offer some resonance?
I really resonated with you talking about that experience of like reflecting on your childhood and going out to nature and having that as your backyard. I think it's not an experience that I've had personally, but I can totally feel what that might have felt like for you at that time and why that is such a beautiful thing to hold.
Yeah.
Thank you for that resonance.
Awesome. Yeah, so Serena grounded us so beautifully in the power of that action. And following the sit-in in Nancy Pelosi's office, we organized 200 congressional office visits all across the country, targeting members of Congress to back the Green New Deal. Then just 3 weeks later, over 1,000 people united again in DC for 3 simultaneous sit-ins targeting Democratic leadership. We targeted Jim McGovern, Steny Hoyer, and Pelosi again. And the most amazing thing was that in the middle of our sit-in in McGovern's office, he came out and said, I'm with you, sign me up. Back, I support the Green New Deal. It was such an immense demonstration of our power. So now, like Serena said, we had people all over the country who were stepping up to join the movement, and we could take bigger action. When the Green New Deal resolution was officially introduced in February 2019, our movement organized a wave of escalated office visits all across the country. I'm gonna share my screen again. And of course, we did more than these, confrontational actions. We registered voters. We knocked on thousands of doors. We've been on tour. This isn't to take away anything from all that steady work to build the movement. It's just to say that if we're being honest, effective political confrontation is the place where Sunrise's power has really registered in the political arena. This is our greatest strength, and as we've seen, it's done a lot. Effective political confrontation can change the conversation and the political weather in this country. We shared a Hill article a couple slides ago, and here's another one, but this time from April after the Green New Deal was introduced. Kayla, could you read that headline?
Yeah. Poll. Climate change is top issue for registered Democrats.
Hell yeah. We completely changed the priorities of a major American political party. So yeah, we can and we should celebrate this work and keep doing it. But we can't be satisfied with that alone. Because remember, we gotta take over. Small scale confrontation cannot overcome the opposition of an entrenched political and economic elite. The Kochs and McConnell and Pelosi, they can all survive a couple of bad news cycles. If we keep doing what we've done, we'll never break through this barrier. This is tough medicine, but it's the truth. I do want to pause for a moment and contextualize all of this. This was our reality before COVID, and now we have to deal with compounding crises. And very similar to the Green New Deal, we have this this concept of a people's bailout, which offers us a solution at the scale of the crisis that we face. But we're made to feel like it's impossible for the very same reasons, right? Like it can only be just a dream. Like Serena said, sitting on that couch almost 2 years ago now. Yeah, and now we're, but we know that's not true. So now we are entering disaster season, and we're gonna have to reckon with the fact that we are gonna have to deal with fires and floods and pollution and coronavirus all at once. Just like with climate change, we're seeing that working class communities, indigenous nations, and communities of color are being hit first and worst from COVID-19 and the economic downturn. We're also seeing the same billionaire class fund anti-shutdown protests and once again place their ability to profit above our right to a livable future. And yet again, at the same time, they are leveraging their influence in government to walk away with the lion's share of stimulus legislation. This is a lot. And before we move into the next section, Celine, you want to do your thing?
Celine, you're muted.
Oh.
Thanks, I am muted. So hi, thanks to anybody that's just joining us today and right now on the live stream. We are jumping into the history of Earth Day and how we've ended up facing the very same existential threats to our air, water, homes, and lives just 50 years later. But don't worry, because we are also covering our solutions to enact comprehensive economic and environmental changes to create a sustainable future. So we just have a few quick links that you can click to take some action now and stay up to date with Sunrise and ask our county commissioners to take appropriate action against COVID-19. So we have our welcome call, which is up on the screen, and it'll drop in the chat. It's bit.ly/sunriseberkswelcome. And that'll be on Friday at 2:30, same time, just Monday, Wednesday, Fridays, usually we do calls. And then you can sign up for email and text updates from your local hub at bit.ly/sunriseberks. And of course, you can sign the emergency petition to the county commissioners regarding COVID-19's response at bit.ly/berks/COVID petition. So now I'm going to hop into talking about what mass non-cooperation is. So what can we do? If political confrontation can overcome an entrenched political and economic elite, what can break through? How can we win solutions that meet the scale of the crisis that we face? And that is mass non-cooperation. Mass non-cooperation is when millions of people refuse to cooperate with the roles and rituals that define daily life and make society function. This picture is of the Flint sit-down strikes against General Motors. It was part of a strike wave of millions of people during the late 30s. These strikers not only walked off the job, but they sat down and occupied the factory itself, making it impossible for the company to produce vehicles and still profit. This inflicted immense economic pain on the company. To regain control of the factory, the company recognized union organizing rights, which gave us the American middle class. In 1937, 400,000 industrial workers participated in over 500 sit-down strikes lasting a day or more, and over 2 million workers participated in labor demonstrations of some kind or another. So This scale of labor strikes and organizing was fundamental to winning the programs of the New Deal. Does anybody know what's going on in this picture? You can unmute yourself, call out, you can drop it in the chat as well, and I can read it out.
Yeah, I can say I think this picture is a moment where Black men chose to sit at the table that at the time people were refusing to give them service and allow them to be in that space.
Yeah, exactly. Just like Serena echoed as well, the lunch counter sit-ins. This is a photo of the first student-led lunch counter sit-in in 1960. It was in Greensboro, North Carolina, and this was the first of a massive and sustained wave of non-cooperation in the early 60s. At the height of the sit-in movement, 1 in every 4 Black college students in the South participated in a desegregation sit-in, and many more community members participated in accompanying boycotts. I'm going to say that again. 1 in every 4 Black college students in the South was involved in the movement. And I really want everybody to just pause and reflect on the scale of that participation. All right. And thousands of people in the movement also took massive acts of personal sacrifice. Participants endured verbal and physical violence, and thousands were arrested, and many more served jail time for these demonstrations. The social movement activity was highly disruptive to everyday life, and what followed was major victories to end segregation. So a big part of this message here is that strikes work. Last winter, the mere threat of a strike from the flight attendants union was the thing that forced Trump to end his government shutdown. And if you don't know already, the flight attendants union is a big supporter of the Green New Deal. Climate change grounds flights right now, and it's threatening their job security. Imagine a general strike alongside the flight attendants union. So I'm going to pass this over to Matt, and he can talk to us a little bit about the scale.
Awesome. So let's talk about that scale. What is our recent history with strikes? So in this here, we see the yearly number of strikes from 1947 to present. And we can see that from 47 to about 1980, there were roughly 150 to 450 strikes every year for various issues, but then things really heavily dropped off. And take a look at 1970, and that was when there was the first Earth Day. And that year, Nixon's administration passed the most comprehensive environmental legislation this country's ever seen. Some of it includes the EPA, or the Environmental Protection Agency, the Clean Air Act, and the Clean Water Act. And then we see a slow downward trend from there. But we do see a small uptick in 2018. Does anybody know what was happening? I'm going to drop it in the chat or call out what was happening.
Bad presidents.
Yes. So a record number of US workers went on strike. As you can see from that headline right there from Vox that says that. Does anybody remember any of these? There were the teacher strike, the Marriott workers strike, the steel workers, nurses. I don't know if anybody has any other examples from then, but yeah. And like Celine was saying, strikes work. And so I want to, oh yeah, thank you to Jane for that one, for the museum workers. That was a big one too. So I want to, sorry, I just gotta move my screen. I want to take a look at oh, that's really great. Okay, so you were in West Virginia for the teacher's strike. I want to take a look at 1964. And earlier we talked about the lunch counter sit-in starting in 1960. But in 1964, the Civil Rights Act was passed as a result of massively coordinated civil disobedience. And does anyone know who the president was in 1964? Feel free to drop it in the chat, take yourself off mute.
Johnson?
Yeah. Yeah, LBJ, President Lyndon Johnson, who was a conservative Southern Democrat. Not exactly a liberal sweetheart. And just like while we're on this, does anybody on this call have any experiences from this time that they'd like to share?
Well, Johnson was president because he was Jack Kennedy's vice president. And in November the year before, Kennedy was killed in Texas and Johnson became the president. And it was a real cultural shift. Kennedy was this, New England, suave, New England, Massachusetts, Hyannisport kind of a Harvard guy. And here's Johnson was crude, very much a Texan, who, as Matt was saying, was not exactly a liberal sweetheart, but some interesting dynamics occurred between him and Dr. King, and he was pushed. He knew what it was going to cost. It cost the Democratic Party dominance for decades to come. But he, because he was pushed from the outside, believe me, it wasn't coming from the Democratic Party at all. It was coming from the outside. Because he was pushed from the outside, he signed the Civil Rights Act.
Great, thank you for sharing. I don't know if anybody else wants to jump in, but like Jane was just saying, we saw what can happen when mass non-cooperation grows to scale. So let's go back to the New Deal. And we already talked about the sit-down strikes of the auto workers in Michigan. And this was right here in Reading. So that's pretty awesome. So on the left, you can see a flyer from 1933 for 6 strikes at the, I'm going to totally butcher that, the hosiery mills, and 4 being sit-down strikes. And the Howard Hosiery Mill mentioned up there is the new Yackham Center for the Arts building on Penn Ave in Sinking Spring between Adelphia and Pizza Hut. And the textile workers from the textile workers strike of 1934 was the largest strike of the time, including about 500,000 textile workers from New England through the South, and lasted 22 days. So the photo on the right shows Reading workers participating in a textile workers strike, and over 10,000 people participated just here in Reading. So to really put things in perspective, let's look at the scale of strikes from 1919 to 1941. So in 1933, FDR passed the National Industrial Recovery Act, which was far from perfect, but federally recognized the right to unionize and collectively bargain, which energized the labor movement to fight even harder. And we can totally see how strikes spiked from there. So let's compare this chart to the last one that we looked at. So the amount of strikes in the middle of the century doesn't even compare to the time between 1919 and 1941, where the low was 500 a year and the peak was over 4,500 strikes in 1937. So true civil disobedience is unknown to our generation. And honestly, like hell, it's unknown to our parents' generation. Only our grandparents and great-grandparents really knew what it meant to radically demand change. And we've been brought up believing that change on this scale just isn't possible, when the reality is that it's simply not recent, but there's no reason that it shouldn't be. So now we know that people were organizing massive amounts of people power. And we also know, we also know that movements had political allies in office passing legislation that enabled them to keep mobilizing. And sometimes they weren't even allies, they were just politicians who were movable and responsive to the demands of the movement. But there was another place, or there's another piece at play here. And all of these movements were operating within a political common sense that helped strengthen their base building and their political power. So I don't know if Troy wants to do.
Oh yeah, quick interjection for people just joining in. We're talking about the history of Earth Day, how we ended up facing these existential threats to our air, water, and homes. But we're also covering solutions and doing a bit of dive into our country's recent history. Some ways that you can get immediately involved are to join our welcome call on Friday, bit.ly/sunriseberkswelcome. Also going to be dropped in the chat. Sign up for text and email updates from us, bit.ly/sunriseberks. And also sign this emergency petition to the county commissioners regarding COVID-19 response, bit.ly/Berks COVID petition. So now I am gonna pass it to Serena to take us into the next section.
Yes. So go take those actions, and we're going to talk about political alignments. So let's consider the question, how does our political common sense change over time? So let's review for a moment. We know that we need a Green New Deal. We know that we need the Green New Deal to match the scale of the climate crisis. And we need a people's bailout to match the scale of the COVID crisis. And those things require massive government action. But unfortunately, massive government action on the scale that we're talking about is quite different from the political common sense of our society today. The common sense of our society right now is more focused on solutions that are created by a free market and the economy, and not solutions that stem from government action. So many of the proposed solutions that we have right now don't reach anywhere near the scale that we need and the scale that's truly required by science and by justice. And both political parties have been proponents of weak, watered down solutions that continue to prioritize profit over the lives of people. This is not just a one party thing. This is a lot of our elected people right now. So unfortunately, the massive government action to stop climate change isn't in the common sense right now. And so what that means for us as organizers and Green New Deal supporters is that we have a uphill task ahead of us. I'm sure all of you feel that a lot. And our goal as Sunrise is to help shift the political common sense of our nation and create a political landscape in which the Green New Deal is a political possibility. So we talked about how FDR passed the New Deal as his second Bill of Rights, and which he proposed in his "The only thing to fear is fear itself" speech. And he proposed this second Bill of Rights because he felt that the Bill of Rights didn't actually protect Americans. So you can see on the screen, the bill includes things like a job. Every person is entitled to a job and medical care and a decent home and a good education and a few other things. And while this bill might seem radical or impossible now, during the Green New Deal period, it was widely understood among a large amount of people and a critical mass of politicians that these were the goals. These were what we needed in order to get our society out of massive economic upheaval from the Great Depression. And it was the responsibility of government to secure these rights and provide services for the people and for the common good. It's pretty different from how we might think about that now. So I'm wondering if anyone has any examples or projects that came out of the New Deal. There are some on the screen, but if anyone has anything else that they would like to drop in the chat, I will read it out.
I think that some of our forests were actually a part of the New Deal in Pennsylvania. I'm not sure entirely which ones, but somebody had said to me about the statistics of like how Pennsylvania was not nearly as forested during that time as we have seen it as we've grown up. Might have been Troy.
Yeah, I learned that from Troy just the other day too. But I was aware that the CCC was really responsible for a lot of the improvements in tree planting, both in the state of Pennsylvania and throughout national parks. So I think they concentrated on state parks in Pennsylvania, but the WPA did a lot, and another project group called the PWA, not to be confusing, actually established a lot of the buildings that we have here in Berks County. You know, the courthouse, the original Antietam Dam, the original Angelica Dam. It's amazing. It's a whole list of things. So yeah.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks for sharing that. That was some of that I didn't even know. And it's always great to hear about new things that happen, you know, locally. There was massive tree planting initiatives, and yeah. So also on the screen are some other things that came out of the New Deal: better labor practices, weekends, minimum wage, social safety nets like Social Security, anti-monopoly laws, environmental regulations and farming programs, Federal Housing Administration, Works Progress Administration. These are things that we now, you know, like they're accepted, they're pieces of our society, they're widely known. But at one time, all of these things were also radical and not widely accepted. So moving to the next slide, Xavier, would you read this quote?
Yeah, I can.
You're muted.
All right, thank you so much. Yeah, I can totally read that. And I also want to acknowledge Jane just dropped in the chat. She said that her mom helped to write the original Social Security legislation. That's really amazing. So we totally stand on the shoulders of giants, and I'm so happy to have you here as part of the group. Okay, I'll read this for you. So from President Eisenhower, when he was talking about a political common sense, he said, should any political party attempt to abolish Social Security, unemployment insurance, and eliminate labor laws and farm programs, you would not hear of that party again in our political history. There is a tiny splinter group, of course, that believes you can do these things. Their number is negligible and they are stupid. He said that in 1954, way before we had our first Earth Day.
Thank you for reading that. We were faced with a choice as a nation to either take bold steps forward or to remain in economic and social degradation. So during this time, many politicians' values and visions of the future were aligned. This quote really shows where people's values were. I mean, he said, if you didn't believe this, you were stupid. That's quite a stand. And even though Eisenhower was, you know, in a different political party than FDR, and the two disagreed on a lot, they were able to have the same values and agree on these programs and agree that they were necessary. And the reason that was possible was because of this widely accepted political common sense. These programs were part of that political common sense. So because enough politicians and people shared these views, we saw systemic change. We saw new programs being implemented. We saw the language that we talked about things with change. And we saw their morals reflected in the policies of the time. So moving to the next slide, we just talked about some commonly held values. So when those values were translated into policies, we see our society really changed for the better. But this didn't come out of nowhere. It took a lot of pushing. And like we talked about, the New Deal was built and fought for by a lot of people. It took many groups pushing politicians and society together, coming together, and to push society into a new direction. It wasn't just one person or one group. It was the common understanding of what we expected from our government and how we needed our government to work. And that's why we like to use the New Deal as an example for what we call alignments, because it can be hard to visualize what massive change might look like, especially, you know, we weren't alive in the times of huge protesting and rising up of people, as we just talked about. And so to look at this is really helpful to help us visualize it. So political alignments are made up of movements and also of particular institutions or groups, and the groups that are aligned with values come together in partnerships, and they are what make up the movements. So when a political alignment becomes dominant, that means that it is able to define the common sense of society. The movements can include like social movements, but also economic, faith, cultural movements. A lot of options here. And these are the group. There are also groups that operate outside of movements, but share the same goal. So I would like to talk about this graphic. This is from Beyond the Choir, and they created this visual to help us kind of conceptualize what we've just been talking about. And I'd also like to read some of the comments. There was a good comment that I wanted to bring up. Jane wrote that beautiful murals in post offices and elsewhere were painted by artists funded by the New Deal. And as Xavier brought up, Jane's mom also helped write the original Social Security legislation, which is really cool. And Sarah wrote that she learned that the original language of our PA Clean Streams laws in the New Deal era, just learned about that, and ordering no new pollution and all existing pollution to be addressed immediately. I'm wondering if Jane wants to briefly talk about her mom helping to write Social Security legislation before I pass it off.
Thanks, Serena. The truth is that I really didn't know too much about this. This happened long before I was born. And you know, this story about my mom is really complicated one. She did a lot of amazing things. That was one of them. She also interviewed Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam. But she spent the second half of her life, and the part that I shared with her, pretty profoundly depressed, because she was not a successful wife. And so that's that's I have a really complicated relationship to my mother's story, but it's all the same. It's all fits together. It's the patriarchy, that a woman like that should have been crushed by cultural expectations that didn't support her.
Thank
I
you
can tell
for
that
sharing.
she was, I don't know. My mother was a liberal. And with all that entails. And so, I mean, I'm just wildly proud of what she did. But she didn't have the analysis. She didn't have the sense of interconnectedness and intersectionality that we all are able to talk about now. So, she was, I don't know. That's all I can say about her right now.
Thank you for sharing that, and the complicated, all the complicated pieces. I really appreciate that. Okay, so we're a little bit we're done with this section. So I would like to pass it to Xavier.
Hey, yeah, thanks. Jane, I totally appreciated your story, and I really resonated with the connection that you had with your mom. And I think it's really profound that you had the time and connection with her to like really understand the different parts of her past as well. And thank you, Serena. I'm gonna continue talking about what a political framework looks like in contrast to the New Deal of back then and the framework that we're working within right now. So Troy has brought up on this next slide what the New Deal alignment looked like. And I want you all to take a minute just to look at what these groups were. I'll read the sections at the bottom first. And I want you to think about what these groups represented in their different sections and how they could have worked together. So the New Deal alignment of the time was comprised of labor unions, civil rights and Black freedom movement groups, capitalist reformers, and Southern whites. And within those groups, you had the Socialist Party, you had the NAACP, you had intellectuals that were centered within universities, and industrial business leaders, and also poor farmers and families and workers. And I want to take a moment to reflect and ask if there's anything that you guys can like immediately bring to mind that you feel like these groups are likely to have not agreed upon.
Yeah, I feel like the poor farmers and workers probably would not hold the same things as like the intellectuals at leading universities. And I feel like it's probably the same with industrial business leaders versus the Socialist Party. I feel like the idea of what is most important would differ pretty greatly between those groups.
I appreciate that completely. I think that's very true. There's a lot of different backgrounds of different people that live very different lives in different spaces in different communities. People's communities and lifestyles are completely different. So it's very reasonable that there is going to be some tension with each one of these groups because of those fundamental differences. So thank you for that. There were still some underlying alignments because they had the shared idea that the economy and the political system needed to change. I think that's something that we can also very much resonate with today. They also all had a common desire for the government to secure their rights to a good life, a good job, and to protect the working class. So political alignments can be messy like that, but people in the political alignments don't always have to agree on every decision and every single cause. So we will all have to navigate that by showing our common values and our common vision for the government. So even though there were tensions between these groups in the New Deal alignment, the same values were held by a ton of people and some really supportive presidents and politicians across the aisle. And I think that's also something that we can resonate with today. As Serena had mentioned earlier, us having pushed for the Green New Deal, and there's so many politicians that have signed on. You were saying, you remember when there was just 2, and now we're up to 99, and there are people that are really jumping on because we all recognize we need this massive change across our entire government. So this alignment at their time had gained public support and political power, which had helped them to dominate the political alignment. But even though it was dominant back then, we obviously don't live under what the New Deal was supposed to be then today. So reflecting on that, what happened? Their New Deal simply left people out. When the reality is that even though the goal of the New Deal policies were to guarantee rights to every man, unfortunately, every man really meant every white man, as is commonly seen of the legislation back then and legislation today. The reality is the New Deal left people out consistently. The benefits of the New Deal didn't apply to Black Americans, Chinese and Filipino laborers, Japanese Americans, or to a lot of women in the same way. Sometimes these policies even made segregation and discrimination worse, which I think we can still resonate with today in 2020. So for example, the Federal Housing Administration exacerbated segregation by excluding Black families and neighborhoods from loans. Agricultural and domestic workers were excluded from Social Security and farming subsidies, and were not inclusive to immigrants or African Americans. So there's still a huge wealth gap and land ownership inequalities in that industry today. And remembering the tensions between those groups that were mentioned before, it is very clear why these gaps were left in the policies. Well, I also want to emphasize that these critical differences started to break down the very foundation of the alignment, and the cracks really started to widen in the late 1960s. So what was going on in the late 1960s? As Jane and Risa had emphasized before, we saw the civil rights movement, we saw labor movements, we saw Vietnam. And I want to ask if y'all want to mention anything that I've brought to the surface for you, either Jane or Risa or any other folks from Birch Stands Up.
It's impossible to understate the fractures in society in the late 60s and early 70s. It was I don't know, has anybody seen Mad Men? You know, the show? So we went from the 50s, which was encapsulated by Mad Men for the rich people and the suburbanites, this sort of, you know, consumerist, very male dominated, alcohol fueled society, very institutional. And then the 60s came along, and the war, civil rights, the women's movement, drugs, birth control, all of these things just boom happened. And there was just a massive sort of emotional, political, spiritual disruption. It's it was necessary to break out of the 50s, really deeply necessary, but it was also really destructive in a lot of ways. I see it in a different way now with what the right wing media is doing. I mean, just these like different worlds, people operating in different worlds. But yeah, kids that were graduating in 19 anytime between like 1967 to almost the end of the 70s were just completely torn, just shredded. Do I go work for IBM or do I flee the country and go to Canada so I don't have to get drafted? It was I don't know. I forgot what the question was. It was
That's okay. I think you really emphasized some really key points that I wanted to focus on too. That I think you really emphasized that there was so many things going on from so many different communities, so many different issues being raised to the surface, and with so many interests being pulled at all at the same time, it really did create that destructive platform for politics to be played at that time. And I think one thing I do want to close on that point with is that the racism that was still cemented within those policies began to tear apart the political alignment of the New Deal and the New Deal itself. So on that note, closing out the New Deal of that time, I want to pass it over to Chloe. And are you on here?
Yep.
Okay. All right. Awesome. You take it over.
Cool. So as Xavier identified, racism and a lot of other factors that escalated during the 60s and 70s caused the New Deal to fall apart. And so starting with Reagan, starting with Nixon, but especially with Reagan, Republicans saw this fracture as a political opportunity. And that is where the Reagan alignment was born. So we have this slide here, this visual, and I just want to take a second to dig deep into each of these different movements and talk about each of them because we're still living under the Reagan alignment today. So moving from left to right, we have the free market capitalists, the cold warriors, the family values groups, and white populists. These are a little less self-explanatory than the New Deal movement, so I'm going to take a moment to define each of them. So the free market capitalists was a movement economic system that continues to seek to minimize government control and maximize the role of the market. The Cold Warriors were conservative intellectuals who believed that the US was an empire that needed to destroy the USSR. So out of that, they pushed for increased militarization and they ballooned defense spending in much of the global South to protect them from communism. So if you guys are familiar with the domino effect, trying to prevent communism from spreading in other countries. Family values, so the rise of religious values and the new Christian right presence in our political system. They used rhetoric that American family values were in decline after the political unrest of the 60s and 70s, and that traditional values needed to be restored. This often led to ideas and policies that excluded and demonized queer people and people of color, and also led to the polarization and the rollout around abortion and led to misogynist policies which challenged women's rights and the right to choose. And then the last one on here is white populism. So that fed the narrative that America is for the people, but excluded many of those people. It took the economic plight of the white working class and used it to rationalize a top-down economy. And we see that still today with kind of fear about the rights of white working class being taken away or threatened by people of color having those same rights. So it's not necessary to know all the details about all of these different groups because there are several. But does anyone have any questions or any observations that they wanted to make about some of these groups? Feel free to put something in the chat or shout it out. Celine said they all put aside their differences so they could accomplish their common goals. So just like the New Deal, we see the same sort of collaboration. Anyone else?
I'd say
Now, I feel the need to point out that a lot of these themes are really old. Free market capitalism has been around since the beginning of this nation. White populism has been around since the beginning of this nation. Family values is a tool. It's just a tool. I remember the first time there was an election and they do those surveys of people that exit the polling booth. It's like, so what do you think? And all of a sudden people were saying, yeah, I voted for family values. And it's like, what? Excuse me? And they meant something very specific. That was just a tool, but free market capitalism and it's sort of handmaiden, which is the myth of the self-made man and the power of individualism, is as old and as dangerous as this country. And you see it right now. You see it right now with if you can't make it, you're a loser. If you can't make it, you did something wrong. If you're sick, you didn't take care of yourself. If you're poor, well, you shouldn't have married that immigrant. All this stuff, it's all exactly the same.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Jane, and giving some more context. Were you about to say something, Xavier, too, or?
Sorry, thanks. I wanted to totally second what Jane said. You totally pulled at some of the things that I was thinking and like double down. And I wanted to like really emphasize one thing that you brought to my mind. And that's many of these groups today still stand and consistently use coded language. And I think what you emphasized about like saying family values, but it really meant something more specific. I think that that's true for every single group within the alignment. They consistently will talk about one thing when they really are using like dog whistles and call outs to their supporters. And it's still very prevalent today.
I think some of the language goes back to our way back to frontier times. It's this whole idea of rugged individualism, that you have to lift yourself up by your own bootstraps and make your way in the world. And it's embarrassing and dishonorable to get any kind of government help. And then that translated into, well, we can help you if the big businesses are doing well, that old trickle down economy thing. If you support the big business, it'll eventually get down to you. We're still waiting for that,
I appreciate you bringing in trickle down economics.
This whole anti-shutdown Chris calls it pro-COVID. Mm-hmm. The anti-shutdown stuff, it's all the same anti-government ideology that's been with us since the beginning, and that has been weaponized since the New Deal. Since the New Deal galvanized wealthy people to push back against government.
Yeah,
exactly the same stuff.
I think it's interesting too what you said, Risa, just to quick respond when you mentioned, I think one of the most powerful things about the narrative that the Reagan alignment and people still use today is the way that they're able to spin who Americans are And even if the founding fathers weren't quote unquote, well, they definitely weren't perfect, but even if they weren't, if they came to the future and were like, yes, we are, free market capitalists, the way that they're able to talk about who the founding fathers are, what American values, quote unquote, are, they've really, as we can see, have really changed the political and cultural common sense. So thanks for everyone's points. Definitely appreciate those. Cool. So what the Reagan alignment has accomplished is it's destroyed a social safety net, which we've seen very viscerally and immediately in this time. It's led to neoliberal trade deals that were based in free market economics. It accelerated military spending. It led to the war on drugs and mass incarceration, which we're still dealing with today. Led to rollback of environmental policy, which again, still continues today. And it led to massive wealth inequality, which is just continuing to increase. So what was their main strategy? So as we saw, there are a lot of different interests in the Reagan alignment, but there is something powerful that unites them all. And as Xavier was talking about, this goes back to the initial cracks in the New Deal alignment that made the Reagan alignment possible. So if you're thinking about that visual of the New Deal alignment, one point that wasn't which I noticed is the fact that there were people who were the Dixiecrat Democrats who were pro-segregation, but were part of the New Deal alignment with people who were fighting for civil rights. And kind of with the acceleration of that in the 60s and 70s, that those kind of divides between those groups and other kind of fundamental differences between those groups allowed the Reagan alignment to step in with something built very solidly on the fears that people had. And a lot of that was unfortunately based on racist ideologies. So the elite strategy has always been to use racism to stigmatize government action for the public good. This means that a small group of wealthy white men knew that dividing people would ultimately serve their interests and allow them to cut public programs. So it looks like we're due for a DJ check, a radio DJ check, if you want to take that, Xavier.
I think it's a story from Xavier actually. Which, yeah, right. That's what I see.
So if there is anybody who's just joining, I'm gonna quick share a little bit of something that I noticed in my life about how the Reagan alignment is still prevalent today, and how 50 years of Earth Days has not moved us towards a more just economy. So I want to pull on something that that Jane had said, and that was that the people that are supporting the people going back to work in the middle of this COVID crisis are the people that are pro-COVID, and there's a lot to be said there. There is a major ideology that that if you go to work, that the government is going to take care of you and your workplace is going to take care of you, but that's simply not the case. So for my story, I left high school back in 2015, and I went straight to work. Started working at a factory job. Palmer's is a massive employer here in my city of Reading, and I worked there along with my mom and my older brother and my uncle at the time. Since then, my cousin Eric, my cousin Brandon, my cousin Brooke, and my cousin Cordell, and even my cousin Asia had worked there for I think like 3 months at one point. But it's a major part of my family to be connected to this company, and in the short time that I was there. And 2 years is short for me because my mom and my uncle have worked there for 20 plus years. So in the time that yeah. Palmer's Candy has nothing to do with Jane Palmer. Very different. Very different. So in the short time that I worked for Palmer's Candy, I recognized that that their focus was only to produce as much profit as possible. At the time, I remember finding out about the people that lived in Africa that were harvesting the cocoa beans, and the people that had never even been exposed to what Hershey chocolate tastes like. And that got me thinking about what is the purpose of this company. And I remember thinking I don't want to contribute my work and my time to a company that doesn't give back to the people, give back to the communities. And I saw that even closer to home when there were things that would happen on the factory floor, when people would have disagreements, when people weren't working fast enough, when people needed sick time, needed time with their families, and and that's happening right now. My mom has asthma, very very severe asthma. So does my grandmother, who she lives with. So if my mom were to continue going to work every single day at Palmer Candy Factory, then she would be exposing herself and my grandmother and the rest of my family, who's heavily at risk for greater chances of fatality from the COVID virus. To She'd be exposing everybody to that risk at way higher rates. And within the time that we've seen many companies in Pennsylvania independently choose to send their employees home with like pressure from the government, like DECA, for example, who released their entire staff, sent them home with paid time off. Palmer's is still running today, and my mom is luckily one of the only people. Well, luckily for her, she's one of the people that was permitted by her doctor to stay home specifically because of her higher risk because of asthma. But my uncle hasn't gotten that accommodation. Many of the people who are struggling working at Palmer's, getting $10 an hour, are still struggling and are forced to go to work and put themselves at risk, despite Palmer's Candy Factory having had 2 found and tested cases of COVID within their buildings. And now my mom is still in fear because she's concerned that now that they've seen these 2 cases and they did a wipe down of the whole place and now they're taking people's temperatures, my mom's worried that she might end up getting pulled back into this job suddenly because her employers have decided it's time for them to create more profits. And my mom's health is not a concern for them. And my family's health is not a concern for them. And I think the connection that I really want to emphasize here is that the Reagan alignment has enabled companies like this to deprioritize individuals and our specific needs. If we had a society that supported individuals and their needs for accommodations and actually prioritize workers' health, then we wouldn't be concerned about fear for talking to HR. We wouldn't be afraid of our workplace or, reaching out to our senators and our local officials, which haven't done enough. They really haven't done enough to support any workers in this time. So I think that's what I want to close and emphasize on.
Thanks, Xavier. I know I really felt like my heart drop when you were talking about that feeling of feeling undervalued. If some other people want to drop some resonance in the chat, thanks for sharing your story, Xavier. If some other people also want to drop, some ways that they've been affected by the Reagan alignment, one of the main points here that we're getting at is that, it's like this theoretical thing, but it also affects each of us and our families and our communities in a really personal way. So with that being said, I want us to think back to that strike chart that we saw, and we saw a really steep decline in organized labor's power, like inverse to the rise of the Reagan alignment. And one key lesson that I really want to emphasize is that everybody is getting hurt in this situation, but we're not hurt equally. Strategic racism is being used to turn us against each other, and even when it doesn't bring us any tangible benefit, or could hurt us materially. The Reagan alignment became dominant through making a lot of values common sense, even to the people that they directly harmed. That means that in order for us to transform society in the ways that we need, we have to make our values common sense, because no alignment lasts forever. And I want to pass it to Addison to take us out with some hopeful info.
All right. So here's the issue we're facing. We can't stop the climate change under Reagan alignment. As long as it continues to alter our society's view of normal, things like small government, individualism, deregulation, and privatization will all be touted as common sense, and we won't be able to get anything done. We also have to make a change in we also saw a change in the common sense. What once used to be done through group action is now done through individual action. And there's a direct correlation between the rise in the Reagan alignment and the taming of Earth Day. It's why for decades we were only able to do recycling, turn off the lights, and carpooling. It's also why solutions coming out of our Congress are all market-based ones like carbon taxes. Good news is just because all these movements and groups are in the Reagan alignment together doesn't mean they completely agree on everything. It just means they can live with each other just for the small while that they are. United forms of strategic racism have had their way with them, and they've been able to form a small government and the values, and the value of small government and the value of people, place the values of individualism in the government. And tensions are rising in the Reagan alignment. It's fracturing. But not all groups in this alignment take the same side on all these issues. We believe that this in particular moment is one that we will be able to exploit and be able to use to our own advantage. Tensions are rising within it, and the Reagan alignment is about to break apart. If anybody sees anything like that happening today, such as people believing it's not working or stagnating wealth, please feel free to put that in the chat or unmute your mics.
I see tension between religion, like religion as a larger structure, and how that plays into the Reagan alignment, because we're seeing a lot of the younger generation shy away from that, so they don't have as much power anymore.
It's awesome. It is true.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna say I'm also seeing with the president taking really strong stances and taking their political to the shittiest extreme. I think a lot of people are really reflecting on what their party represents and choosing not to be aligned with it.
Awesome. So what does this mean for us? This means we have an historic opportunity to realign our political system as we know it. And that creates space for a people's alignment. And what does that mean? That means we can get away with the Reagan alignment and create one that reclaims the power of government for the common good. Break the oppressive chains of racism, so that way the right to a good job, clean air and water, and safe environment can once again become normal in our society. And in order to actually visualize what a Reagan or what a people's alignment would look like, we've been able to create this chart here that actually helps us conceptualize it, which I'm actually going to have Xavier read if you wouldn't mind.
You're muted, Xavier.
Thank you. Sorry about that again. So within the People's Alignment, the groups that are supporting things like the People's Bailout and the Green New Deal, we see groups like Sunrise and other youth-led groups that are focused on climate justice. And we also see groups that are focused on racial injustice and racial justice and inclusion. People like Make the Road, centered on immigrant rights. And we also see labor and economic justice groups like labor unions. And we also see sustainable businesses and a new economy growing up. And that can look like B corporations, renewable energy industries, and in between each one of these larger all-encompassing labels, there's also groups in between these lines, which might look like native tribes and organizations and just general environmental justice groups, as well as teachers, healthcare workers, and worker co-ops. So back to you.
It's, I believe, passing it off to Chloe now, to bring it on home for us.
Great, thanks Addison. Thanks Addison and Xavier for introducing the People's Alignment to us. So our job is to bring the climate movement and supporters of climate action to the People's Alignment. We can't stop climate change without changing our political alignment, which means people who advocate for incremental climate action or free market solutions need to be brought over to the People's Alignment. It's also to make sure that emerging People's Alignment has reason to place trust in the climate movement. And we do that through keeping all of our messaging rooted in our values of dignity and equality for all people. And I want to add to that, really, moving beyond our messaging too, and really building everything, even the fundamental building blocks of our organizations, which are our relationships, in the beliefs that we have about the dignity and quality of every living person, every person. This means that we're not trying to fight every fight, and because we can't. I think it's important to realize that Sunrise is rooted in climate justice. And even though we believe in a lot of different issues, and we believe in a lot of, we believe and understand the intersectionality of the issues that we're facing, we also recognize that there are other groups that we're working with that have different strengths and are able to speak to different issues than we are. And so rather than trying to fight every part of the issue and try to take on all of the issues, I think it's important to step back and understand where we can lead, where we can support, and how we can collaborate with a lot of different groups that share our values. And I think the number one thing that is important to keep in mind is we need to build what we are capable of building, which is a powerful and strong climate movement, again, rooted in our values of dignity and quality of people, in that People's Alignment. And so, yeah, here, how do we build a stronger climate movement and support the People's Alignment? Again, it's building a strong climate movement. It's also building partnerships like Sunrise is doing with a lot of groups in Berks County and across the US that have those shared values of equality, dignity, justice, health, and that share kind of common enemies like the wealthy elites that have caused the conditions that we live in and are grappling with. So I wanted to hand the mic over to Sarah to share a story about how the climate movement has failed to really be in solidarity with other movements and has failed frontline communities.
So full transparency, just started thinking about this yesterday. And so a lot of things came to mind. There's definitely like a lot of ways in which frontline communities get let down by different like parts of the climate or the like environmental movement in general. So I'll just kind of like bounce around. Don't expect anything to be too structured. But as Xavier mentioned earlier, communities of color are subjected to more air and water pollution. And I just want to look at specifically South Philly and the refinery explosion at Philly Energy Solutions that happened, I think it was last year. All of this time is honestly really blending together, but it feels like it was last year. Where initially folks were told that the air was not dangerous by officials, whereas the EPA later said that there were several violations. And we know that South Philly has really high communities of color. And so that was also like mirrored in Detroit, where there's also like primarily like Black and brown communities that were around the Marathon refinery there. And that was also just recently shut down after decades of poisoning those communities of color. And then it also makes me think about having heard so many different stories from different people in Reading with breathing difficulties and asthma from local industrial pollution, and how we see a lot of that air and water pollution concentrated in communities of color. And then we look at like different kinds of ways that frontline communities are created, and that goes into like where extractive industries plan to have their projects. And so we see a lot of Indigenous communities that ended up suffering the brunt of like really destructive and pollutive industries that come through. And so you look at like the Navajo reservation, which has had for like decades just really awful uranium poisoning, which is made it so that like the entire communities don't have access to clean water. And then this kind of struggle was kind of put front and center with Standing Rock. And so we saw Lakota communities organizing there, because whereas a white community in North Dakota said that they didn't want the pipeline going through their land and it was moved, that same respect isn't given to Indigenous people. And so that's not the environmental movement leaving out frontline communities. That just highlights how these frontline communities are most heavily targeted by environmental destruction and through these extractive industries. But the ways in which those communities are left out and hurt by the movement is that these kinds of issues often bring in a lot of different kinds of organizers or like NGOs, like non-governmental organizations, and a lot of people within the movement who I'm sure think that they're trying to do a lot of good and often end up doing a lot of not good. But they often parachute into communities where there's like a really serious issue going on, and oftentimes local people who are fighting that whatever that issue is, and the orgs that come in often will take advantage of their struggle, eclipse the work being done by the community itself. Oftentimes their entire humanity is just wholly removed from those struggles, and preference is given to protecting like the environment as kind of this like just this like thing that exists without the people who that live there. And those are also, especially in Indigenous communities, the people who've been protecting and defending those lands for like well before like Greenpeace existed. And so you see these communities who are at the front lines historically being removed by white environmentalism. And so if we look at like a specific example of an NGO letting down a movement. One second, I gotta take care of my dog. All right. We can look at like the Sierra Club, for instance, which was created out of a desire to protect like wildlife and national parks for its predominantly white members to enjoy. And there was actually a 1972 study of 1,500 environmental volunteers that found that 98% were white. And so like with such a big focus just being on like say like protecting national parks, it also erases the fact that those national parks lands were stolen land from Indigenous communities, and so, and from different Indigenous peoples. But there's a lot of support behind those kinds of organizations, and they get a lot of funding, and they're able to parachute into those communities and then garner a whole bunch of media buzz, and then have that like feeds and funds their organization further. And they take, like I said, take credit for a lot of local frontline organizing, are able to raise huge sums of money for their org, and then they disappear, taking all those resources and platforms with them. And so this has happened like historically since the environmental movement started, and we see it happening to fucking day. And bouncing back to Standing Rock as an example, Sierra Club was one of many organizations that went out there for however amount of time to show solidarity. And then I actually didn't even know this till today. I knew that they had honored Shailene Woodley that year in 2017 for her activism. But not only did they give her an award to honor her, while Indigenous water protectors were like in jail or prison being political prisoners and like having the judicial system make an example out of them. But they also honored and awarded Michael fucking Bloomberg, which I found that out today. Like, I didn't even know that. I was like living outside back then when it happened, and like it's just absurd. But so I've just seen like a lot of distrust personally, though, in like especially like direct action, like frontline camps that fight extractive industries like on the ground by putting like their bodies on the line. Just have to like really heavily vet individuals from NGOs and even like deny help and assistance from others because like they're afraid of what that does to their cause overall. And so that's one way. That's another way that the movement has let down frontline communities. And then another really huge way is how this whole environmental movement is often so like whitewashed. The histories of imperialism, colonialism, and military interventionism, and how are often ignored, and especially in how that has caused the global South to suffer the most extreme effects of climate crisis. And so thankfully I found myself here in good company of people who like have not been ignoring that. But even so, like there's still ways where even like the best of times and the best of people like ignore like the struggles of those who are suffering most. But another one that I noticed recently from a Native friend in Virginia who's like a medic and a total badass, who had to call out Extinction Rebellion locally in her community, was when they took a tactic that they were using in England, in the UK, where it's called like the Red Brigade or something. I don't know, but they like get dressed up in red, and it's whole like really visually poignant action that they do, which makes sense in their own context. But when Extinction Rebellion or XR members in the US were asked by Indigenous people locally to sorry, Troy just told me I'm definitely going over 5 minutes. Yes. We're asked locally to not use those same tactics because they would, and they did. They ended up doing it, but they ended up taking a lot of media attention and creating that was created around the Red Brigade in the US. But what the tactic was actually doing was stealing the attention that the murdered and missing Indigenous women and children's movement have been using for like a few years to try to highlight how much violence happens within these extractive industries when they go to their communities. And like you'll see whenever like there's like a pipeline being built somewhere, there's Indigenous women and children who become victim of the brutality of some of those workers. And so a lot of the like local context was ignored in just so that some like white organizers could get a photo op in red and then destroy the relationship that they had locally with Indigenous organizers. But the largest way in which I've seen, not the largest, but one of the last ways that I've seen the environmental movement leave behind frontline communities is, so there's unions and labor, which I think Sunrise does a really good job at including labor as one of those frontline communities. But we've seen so there's an organization called Earth First that was formed in 1980 as an alternative to mainstream environmental organizations, and as an alternative to like the liberal appeal to power approach that a lot of others take. And so there was an action, a 3-month-long like action put together called Redwood Summer, and Jody Berry was one of the Earth Firsters that led this. But she actually, so she was a radical environmentalist with a background in labor organizing and also wanted to end the misogyny of the environmental movement, along with the misogyny in the logging industry. And so she actually had attempted to unite loggers with the environmentalists to create a stronger front. And it's not a tactic that you see too often. And I think like you really have to applaud organizations that try to do it like Sunrise does. So what actually happened was after creating that like stronger force, the FBI actually planted a bomb in her car and tried to assassinate her. Which brings me to how I want to focus on this last point, which is that a lot of the environmental movement really trusts the government and the state. And there's a lot of people who can't, due to Indigenous people and people of color being murdered by the state, both like directly and indirectly. And then when we see environmentalists teaming up with labor and unions, you also see the state like attacking people. If we want to pop back to a really famous one, the Battle of Blair Mountain, which happened in West Virginia, which was when a bunch of coal miners decided to unionize, and the coal company did not like that. They brought in like around 3,000 cops and scabs, and then for 5 days in late August, early September of 1921, there were 10,000 armed coal miners that fought against these 3,000 scabs, and then they started threatening to drop bombs on them, and like the whole thing was like shut down after 5 days. You see the state like literally murdering union workers, and like that's a long bloody history of labor in general, but it just is one of the ways in which you highlight how you can't really trust the government or the state to support you and be with you in a lot of these things, especially when you see like the intersections coming together and becoming stronger than the state. And so we see it with union and labor. We saw it at Standing Rock and other frontline direct action camps where they've hired from like mercenaries to local cops to abuse and beat peaceful protesters. We see it when the state passes laws that criminalize dissent and eco-defense, which like is really wild in today's context. But there was a law banning masks after Standing Rock. And then there was also a whole bunch of states that started looking at this critical infrastructure bill that would have felonized any kind of organizing. It was like really broad strokes, any kind of organizing against anything they deemed critical to be critical infrastructure. And so that means that like a lot of protests against like pipelines, for instance, were then criminalized. And then we see it, and Matt went over this a lot earlier, talking about like dark money. And even when it comes to, I found this out yesterday, even when it comes to elected officials, like you really, really can't fucking trust these people sometimes. A lot of times, most of the times, almost every time. Dana Nessel, who was supposed to be like this leader in Michigan as our AG, has been fighting a community-led organization called Ban Fracking in Michigan, who's been focusing on a ballot initiative, because we have those in Michigan, to ban fracking. And she was, Dana Nessel was elected as AG, largely supported by the environmental movement in Michigan, especially clean water focused movements. And turns out, so she's fighting them on their ballot initiative while taking oil and gas money for her own ballot initiative. And allegedly, she also signed the No Fossil Fuel Money Pledge. So somebody's got to get on her. But so that kind of dark money is another reason, which everybody here knows is why we can't trust the state. But also like those good laws that were like the largest successes of like the white early environmental movement, like Matt also went over like the EPA, that the EPA was involved with, and like the Clean Water Act and the Endangered Species Act and all of that. Even those laws, though, like aren't being used to protect the environment, aren't being used to protect frontline communities, and oftentimes as a tactic are just used to get either measly amounts of money from those industries, or occasionally, sometimes it delays construction. But either way, like these kinds of tactics, like sell out frontline communities in the immediate, on their immediate timeline, where their communities are being destroyed, their water's being poisoned, and their resources are being stolen, and makes those issues take a back seat. Okay, I'm sorry I talked so much, but that's pretty much it. Yeah, I'll be done.
I totally want to pass that. I kind of like I dropped some things out of what I was gonna say because you hit on so many of the more important things. So if there's
wait, sorry, it's Chloe to resonate with that first.
Oh yeah, take that then.
No, I was just gonna say, yeah, I really appreciated hearing your very like well thought out, comprehensive answer. I think you touched on so many different things and gave so many amazing examples. And I could hear you talk more about this, honestly. And as someone who works at this Sierra Club, full transparency, I really appreciated the way in which you identified the roots of a lot of the issues that these people face are based in kind of the ideology that the environmental movements had in the past and still have, and the fact that a lot of the systems that environmental movements use are kind of surface level of power, and the way that they kind of exploit the stories and experiences of people who are on the ground experiencing these things. So anyway, I just want to uplift your very comprehensive, really amazing answer, or thoughts there. And yeah, Xavier, what were you saying?
Yeah. I'm gonna skip a few things because I really do want if anybody's like watching this later, please go back and re-listen to some of the things that Sarah had said. I think you hit on a lot of things that really could be and should be expanded more into in depth. But yeah, so I am going to be the last person to close out today, and I want to give y'all some context and reflect and emphasize some of the things that we've talked about today. Maybe give y'all a little bit of hope and some action items as we close out. So reflecting, as Serena said, there are 99 senators who have signed in support of the Green New Deal. And we're getting closer to public ownership of utilities and access to public transit. We're uplifting the intersectionality of so many of these issues, and we're calling out the fossil fuel executives like JP Morgan and Chase, Wells Fargo, Citibank, the Democrats who've been bought out by these corporations, and we're holding them accountable so that we can actually bring forward intersectional solutions like the People's Bailout, like the Green New Deal, and bring them to the people in the communities and accommodate their needs as soon as possible and as comprehensive as possible. And we've also come a long way here at the Berks Hub throughout 2019. We've worked to bridge the gap between climate and immigration. We've hosted and joined vigils at the Berks County Detention Center, and we've launched a field program where we knocked on thousands of doors for the endorsement of county candidates who would shut down the detention center, taking on an entrenched incumbent, and came in with 7 votes of victory. And also, when we were campaigning, all of our school board politicians won. And now through our coalition work and escalating more protest, we've pushed handfuls of politicians to voice support for our efforts. So now I want to reflect a little bit more on how far we've come since Earth Day. And I want to say for decades, a little bit of context, for decades, Democrats have attempted to force Republicans to act on climate, but they couldn't even get them to admit that climate change was real, something that we're still dealing with as a result of their inaction today. And it wasn't until the launch of the Green New Deal and our political confrontation with Mitch McConnell in February of 2019 that he admitted climate change was real. And this is where the bar is, and this is the level of boldness that we need to win solutions that meet the scale of the crisis that we face and so many communities face that are currently entrenched in the platform of the political elite. So while we wait for the people that we support to bring comprehensive solutions like the people bailout to us, we're also partnering with local community partners in a mutual aid network. And we know that the majority of us as Americans are already on our side, prepared for the political common sense to shift and make this livable future that we're demanding our reality. So I want to close out then and highlight some ways that y'all can join us. You can sign up for our email list, so you can stay up to date on all the things that we're doing. You can do that at bit.ly/sunriseberks. You can join us on our welcome call. That's going to be this Friday at 2:30. You can meet the team, which you heard speak today, and learn some more about how to get involved very locally. And you can support our partners at Berks Stands Up, who have a petition for the county commissioners that states that we need a comprehensive response to the COVID-19 crisis that we're facing. So please check out those links and join us in a conversation that gets even more in depth and more personal at Sunrise Berks. Troy, do you want to close out anything else?
That's it. Does everybody just want to take themselves off mute, say Happy Earth Day and goodbye? Happy Earth Day, goodbye.
Happy Earth Day.
Happy Earth Day.
Happy
Happy
Earth
Earth Day. Love to
Everybody.
Pachamama. Bye.
Good job. Everybody did a great job. Thank you.
Thanks for listening.
I like the way the facilitating duties were shared with everyone.